Well, good morning.
Good morning.
How wonderful. Hopefully you heard the instruction to have a hymnal nearby, one that you can look on. But I think I'm going to just start by introducing the person sitting next to me because she's sort of a surprise guest. Not a surprise to me, but a surprise to you.
Oh, it's a surprise to me.
And also a surprise as I was sort of thinking through this conversation this morning. I wanted to, Becca was a conversation partner in the midst of that, and she offered. Now, who is this person? This is the Reverend Rebecca Vargas. She serves in the Metropolitan Washington, D.C. Synod at Grace Lutheran Church in
Fort Washington, Maryland.
Fort Washington, Maryland. All right. How is it that you have come to be here in the Twin Cities today?
I'm in the Twin Cities today because, well, part of my backstory is that I grew up in the DC area. And then I came out to Minnesota when I was 18 years old and went to St. Olaf. And then from St. Olaf, I bounced around a little bit, but landed at Luther Seminary. And if Dr. Sponheim is on this call, I'll be so happy because he's a favorite professor. And so I was at Luther Seminary and including a year of internship, which I took in Pelican Rapids, Minnesota. And then took my first call at at Trinity Lutheran Church in Princeton, Minnesota. So I was in Minnesota for 12 years and developed friendships that were very important to me, including with Peter and Ann. And also during that time, I worked at Christicon Bible Camp in Montana, which is where Peter and Ann and I developed a very close friendship. So this week, I've been in town for a conference. I'm very interested in restorative justice. And the Catholic Church is doing more than we are with restorative justice and restorative justice in the parish in particular. And so there was a conference this week at St. Thomas on restorative justice, and I've been here for that this week, and also got to take a little bit of Sabbath time. So I've gotten to have some social time, including with Ann and Peter and some other friends, and have been staying in the Christ home. So that is how it happens that I am here.
Quickly, just because it's a provocative title, give us an elevator speech on restorative justice, because that would be a topic for a future Sunday forum. I can imagine at some point, yeah, we could have Becca back, or some of your colleagues that are here in the metro that or you.
Restorative justice means a lot of things to a lot of different people. It's sort of a buzzword lately. I was working with incarceration and reentry. I did about 15 years of ministry with people in or coming home from jail. And that's where I came to understand and appreciate restorative justice at a new level. So you can think of it in different ways. Sorry, this is going to be a little bit more than elevator speech, but it won't be.
It's a tall building.
Right, it's a tall building. So you can think of restorative justice as really a mindset, kind of a principle, a philosophy, and it shows up anywhere and everywhere. Let me start the sentence again. There are all kinds of different ways to practice quote unquote justice, and all different understandings of what justice means. If someone is on trial for a murder and they say, we want justice for the person, well, what does that mean? We want somebody to be punished. We want somebody, what is justice? You know, the whole question of what is justice. Anyway, there's the kind of justice where it's eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth. If you step on my toe, I'm going to step on your toe. There's the kind of justice that is retribution. If you did it to me, I'm going to get you back. There's the kind of justice where we have a set of laws, and if you violate this law, this will be the punishment. So of all these different kinds of justice that we practice, restorative justice wants to ask the question, how can we repair the harm that has been done? How can we involve, hopefully, the person who caused the harm, as well as the person that was harmed, as well as the community that surrounds those people, and how can we work together to restore and correct the harm that's been done? And sometimes that means punishment. And sometimes that means somebody has to pay up in some kind of a way. It's not letting people off. It's not cheap and easy. In fact, it's a lot of hard work to get to the place where we come back together as a community and restore. So we can practice restorative justice anywhere and everywhere. There's an and this goes back to our history as people before we started building jails, before we started, we had to figure out how to come together and restore the harm as a community. So there are ancient practices of restorative justice. So you can think of it very broadly, and then there are also some practices in particular that are known as practices of restorative justice. And there are movements in particular that are seeking to implement those practices in the justice system, in the school system. And I'm increasingly interested in how we implement those practices in our church families, in our church communities, both for our internal healing, like the Catholic Church wants to use and practice restorative justice as it continues to heal from the sexual abuse scandal, right? Like, so the internal healing that needs to happen. And also, how can we call on the practices of restorative justice as we develop relationship with the community around us and serve the community around us? So yeah, that's the very tall elevator.
Thank you. Yeah, and helpful. Just a plug for a forum that's on our calendar for later in the last Sunday in November, which is Thanksgiving weekend, the weekend after Thanksgiving. But we're going to be joined by Dr. Kelly Sherman Conroy, who is a member of the Sioux. She grew up in Pine Ridge Reservation, and she is on staff over at Nativity Lutheran in St. Anthony Village, and is a thinker within and a leader within the Lutheran ELCA tradition around issues of indigenous rights and our history and our problematic history with our indigenous brothers and sisters. And she's going to help us think, and it'll be curious to hear if she taps into this concept of a restorative justice and approaches the relationship between the historical church and churches like Prince of Peace with the work that we do, acknowledging and honoring and being in relationship with our indigenous brothers and sisters here in the metro, but also just sort of in the larger context of our society and that kind of stuff. And so that'll be a real gift. That'll be the end of November. She's not only going to lead our Sunday forum, but we've also invited her to preach for us that day. And so expect something pretty thought-provoking, I think, on that last Sunday in November. Okay, now let us turn our attentions to the topic of today, which I want to just give you just a little bit of background, and then I'm going to ask some questions of you. And then Becca and I are going to have a little bit of a dialogue around some of our experiences as pastoral leaders in the church, tending to the ministry of confirmation and faith formation. And we're eager to hear from you about this. Okay, why are we talking about confirmation today? Anybody got an idea? Who was at worship at the first service? Out yourself by raising your hands. Choir, I know you were there. Yeah, and exactly. And just shout out if you remember what the Spark Bible story was about. The 10 Commandments. Where does that fall in the sort of biblical story in the Bible? Where does that appear?
New Testament or Old Testament?
In the New Testament or the Old Testament? Oh, the Old Testament. Who's the central character that we attach to the 10 Commandments? You guys you're nailing it. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
It would have been really embarrassing because as you were all facing me, one of our confirmands wandered into the room. And he knows these answers. I guarantee. So if you can't answer, I'm going to just look to him and he's going to nail No. So, all right. So, Ten Commandments. So as we were looking at our lectionary lineup for the year, the adult education committee that's responsible for planning these forums, what is that guys thinking about? And I'm like, well, confirmation is kicking off this fall, and this is our catechism year. I'll explain that in a minute. And one of the things covered in the catechism are the 10 commandments. And so even though we're not going to start with the 10 commandments in our curriculum this year, they are in the small catechism, and it's one of the things that we're going to talk about. But we also covered 10 commandments last year, and we will again next year in our 2-year cycle, because we do a year on the Bible. And that's one of the central stories are the 10 commandments, and our relationship as Lutherans to something we label as the law. And not only Lutherans label it as the law, but many Christian traditions, and certainly the Hebrew traditions, think of it as the law. And then we also talk about gospel, law and gospel. That's a very Lutheran thing, to hold those two together. Anyways, also, at the time we were planning this, I had no idea what confirmation was going to look like this year, who was going to be teaching it. Because remember, we are looking and searching for a director of children and family ministry. And one of the responsibilities on that position description is to lead our confirmation ministry. That position remains unfilled, and we have not found a candidate to serve in that role. And so I did spend some time after I got back from my sabbatical, recognizing that, knowing that that position had yet to be filled, imagining what are other ways we could accomplish our goals with confirmation ministry this year. Perhaps we could partner with another congregation and, share some resources and structure around that. I contacted every church in the area and explored that conversation. Great conversations and interesting and intriguing possibilities, but no obvious immediate fit. And a lot of that has to do with the dynamics of the particular families that we have here at Prince of Peace, and some of their expectations and how and their schedules and things like that. That really defined the our needs to sort of just charge for it. And so we aren't making any dramatic change to our program this year, although every year is a little bit different. It has a little different shape to it as a result. So that was on my mind, thinking about that. A pure mea culpa to our leadership teams and those involved, that I'm not particularly gifted. I don't see myself as particularly gifted in teaching confirmation. And that I remember having that conversation with my call committee back in 2016. Like, where are the places that you're going to need support, was the question of me, and I named that one in particular for sure, right? The age demographic of middle school it can be a tricky and challenging group. Fantastic kids, absolutely, probably the best collection of kids we have are in that age group. But to connect with them and to teach them and to bring them along, there are people much better at that than I am. I know that, and so it's a limitation for me. And so and I'm being honest in front of one of our students back there who knows firsthand that this ain't the best thing I can do, right? And so so, anyway, but just being honest with you all and with them, I mean, that's I can, I know the content. I can talk about the 10 commandments and bore everyone in the room about the 10 commandments. If that was the goal, to bore you all, I'd feel confident I could accomplish that. But that's not the goal with confirmation. All right. So the goal of today is to sort of share with you a bit about how our program is structured, and maybe to wonder with you how we could tweak it and adapt it. And maybe you've even got some ideas here in the short term that would help us through this time of transition until we find another leader. But even, we're not going to just find the secret to life in this next person either when it comes to confirmation ministry. We might, but I doubt that. Things are changing. Now, raise your hand if you in your life as a child or as a young person, middle school, high school, where in those ages, went through a program that you identify as being a confirmation program? I should have asked it the other way. Is there anybody who didn't? Yeah, fantastic. And so intriguing. So those of you who are sitting near those who just raised their hands, you'll want to have a little conversation together with them in a minute. All right. Did you, who I think it was everybody just here in the front, was Rick and Sharon and I've already forgotten your name, I apologize. Mary Ann and Becca, did you go through any sort of catechesis? That's a tricky word, but it means like adult confirmation later on in life. Did you ever go through a program like that? You did, Rick. Yeah. Yeah.
Very brief.
Yeah, but you and Sharon, your program, you went through something?
It was a 3-month program.
3 months, yeah.
Wow.
And Mary Ann,
It's something similar, only a few years beyond the usual.
yeah. And Becca, before you became a pastor, did you have to be confirmed?
No.
That wasn't in your like candidacy interviews, like when were you confirmed? Or,
Was
yeah.
not,
But you did some religious instruction at some point in your life.
well.
Yeah, the elevator, that short elevator speech.
I was baptized when I was 15 years old, so in as much as confirmation is an affirmation of baptism, I got a pass. And just kind of moved right into the senior high school group. But I never got the instruction.
Cool. When was the first time you heard the story of the 10 Commandments?
I mean, I probably heard it along the way, but it wasn't the 10 Commandments that I felt like I was lacking. It was more of it was probably like the overarching story of scripture.
Yeah.
That
Okay, that's fair. All right. For the rest of you who did just raise your hands, that you went through some sort of formal confirmation program, I want you to, and include the people who didn't, turn into little groups of 2s or 3s and just share a few of the details you remember about what you studied. Then I want to bring it back together and we're going to list some of those and just have you shout them out. But first, talk amongst yourselves and just share with each other and listen. What was your experience and what are the things that you remember about confirmation, instruction, ministry, how do you describe it?
That was about when I was 15. Give me a straight. I think I was about 15 years old and we took a break. I think I remember it well. Like scrambling to memorize information. We had a choice. My dad and the next matter. We don't talk about my neighbor and my So like it was one of the like I remember Pastor like that because they think yeah, he didn't. So I got his parents there. And then
Right.
Okay, if you haven't all had a chance to share, make sure you're all shared a little bit. Give a. Okay, let's just come back together again. And I'm curious, again, this is sort of a raise your hand response, because I bet this came up in some of you. Raise your hand if you started confirmation ministry or began it as a student in 6th grade.
Oh, wow, that's young.
Seems young, okay, yeah. Peter, do you remember if you were?
Yeah, because I was a year,
You were advanced for your age, and so.
just a discrepant year.
Yeah. So, and Tony?
Pastor Peter,
Yeah,
I
and you were
was-
raised
I
Roman
was raised
Catholic.
Roman Catholic, so for us, it was instruction in like the 4th grade.
It's, yeah, and so it was a real methodical, like your Christian, CCD,
Yes.
Christian Catholic,
Yes.
something, what's the acronym?
And I went to public schools, so I was pulled out with the other
Yeah,
kids.
Yeah, anybody else remember the Catholics leaving early on Wednesdays? Yeah. Or the Methodists. Okay, raise your hand if you started in 7th grade. Yeah, almost everybody. And then 8th grade for sure, I'm guessing, right? If you were still in confirmation in 8th grade, anybody just have 1 year of confirmation? Gary?
3 hours a week,
3 hours,
1 year.
all of 7th grade.
8th grade.
8th grade for you, okay. And then anybody 9th grade, all of 9th grade as well. Yep, that was me.
3 full years.
Yep, and so, yeah, I had 3 full years, and then confirmed the fall of my sophomore, would have been confirmed the fall of my sophomore year. I shared with Becca, my family moved between my freshman and sophomore years of high school from Minnesota to New York. And so I had to have my confirmation ceremony, the affirmation of baptism, by myself instead of with my 25 other classmates. It was just me standing in front of the congregation, reciting the Apostles' Creed from memory. No screen helping me out. No adult reading along with me. That was frightening, right? How many of you remember doing something like that at your confirmation service? But at least maybe you had other voices and you could kind of hope that someone was saying, I believe in Jesus. Okay. And so, but reflecting with Becca, I'm like, I had to stand in front of the congregation by myself wearing a white gown and speaking. Maybe that's why I'm a pastor today.
Yeah.
Because I had that one experience, I got over it, so, okay, just share with me and the room an element that you remember, what your confirmation experience included. Bible camp. So yeah, so going to camp was an expectation of the program itself, right? Yeah. Maisie, you raised your hand back there.
I was remembering that the class was stood before the congregation.
Yep.
And we were quizzed by the pastor.
Like on the day of your affirmation, or like just like a normal Sunday, they'd be like, okay, confirmation kids, line up.
No, Scott and I were trained the same way, but was it before?
I think your group had to recite parts of the catechism in
Yeah.
front of the church on the day you were confirmed.
Confirmed, yeah, so it's part of like the liturgy,
For
right?
us, it was the week before.
The week before.
Yeah.
But during a service, during a worship
No,
service,
it was a special night.
special test.
We're lucky.
We
Real
gathered for a
special.
dinner and people sat there. And
Oh, yeah,
we
yeah,
sat
so
in front.
like a public examination is what I'm hearing, okay? Fascinating. Yeah, Anne, what do you remember about your
What I
confirmation?
remember is, spending one Saturday at the Jewish Tabernacle. And another Saturday at St. Mary's Basilica.
So visiting a couple other faith traditions, yeah, okay.
Memorization.
Memorization, yeah, raise your hand if you remember having to memorize the catechism, scripture, those are, you know, anything else, maybe your parents' phone number, but yeah.
Maybe Maisie had the same thing. I don't remember that exactly.
Scott Macy actually grew up in the same church.
But our examination at the end of in ninth grade, right before we were confirmed, was to do a 10-minute speech on some part of the catechism. We all had to write a speech, but only our parents came to that night. It was in the basement of the.
But all the students and their parents, it wasn't just you and your parents, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Couldn't do 25 and then.
Right.
Thankfully, we
A
didn't have to
speech.
do that. That's Scott for the next
Yeah.
speech.
Okay, other requirements of or other experiences, Ruth,
In my church, confirmation was an introduction to the Luther League.
Luther League, yeah, which was youth group, right? Yeah, but really hyper formalized and you know, it had to indoctrinate you into the system, you know, you had to learn Robert's rules somewhere, so you had to learn them at Luther League, right? And
Okay, so by the nineties, things changed a bit.
things are changed, so Anna's a little younger than some of you, and
Generation.
yeah.
So I know you guys are speaking to a lot of the memorization, and I did some of that, but it was like memorizing the commandment. And then in the small catechism it says, this means whatever. And I remember specifically going through class is you would read what the catechism says, and then you would reflect on that and write your own, this means statement within the context of, you know, some broader thinking. And so there was a lot more like in-depth reflection, and instead of just rote memorization about what exactly was in the catechism, to try and make it more meaningful. And then instead of a memorization test at the end, in ninth grade, we spent a couple of weekends doing faith statement, reflection, and writing sessions that were then you read your faith statement, sometimes talking about like, this is a reading in the Bible, this is how this means to my faith moving forward. And it was about a page that you would read on your confirmation, and every confirmand
Had to make a faith statement.
presented their faith statement. I don't know if everybody had to read them out loud because not everyone felt comfortable in church. But I feel like in a shift from rote memorization and some of that, it was a lot more about, this is our faith. And how does that reflect on who you are? What does that mean to you? And how can you live out your faith through the context of these memorized pieces?
And other people who remember doing some kind of a faith statement like that, is that? Yeah, something that you had to generate yourself, yeah, versus just recite.
I was in a massive confirmation class.
Big class over at Gustavus
Yeah,
Adolphus.
and so we're talking 60.
Yeah.
60 something.
Right.
But a couple of things for us that I really remember more is the social aspect of it, the fellowship, because when I started up, they totally redid the concept in the mid-70s. It started with a meal. And so we had our tables set up in the fellowship hall, and then the mothers or fathers, whatever, we had a rotating schedule, who would bring a hot dish. The kids who would bring the big sacks of McDonald's. That was like, You coveted those. But I just think something about the meal coverage,
Yeah.
and then we would get into your class instruction.
That's awesome.
But one of the things I remember is we always had 2 retreats, the 2 years I had confirmation. And the winter retreat up at Shores of St. Andrew Bible camp was, the pastors had us collaborate to create a class creed. So basically,
A faith statement.
basically a faith statement,
Yeah.
class creed.
Yeah, wonderful. Gary, last reflection on
Oh,
past practices.
this wasn't practice.
Oh,
I remember our pastor telling us we were the worst class he'd ever had.
I believe that.
And he was considering another call and he was kicking it. We were one of the main reasons.
Well, to that point, and actually, as Jim was speaking, and maybe you were inspired by the same thing, I do remember that there was deep camaraderie within my confirmation class around like messing with the teacher. Like, how could we, you know, pull a joke on the teacher, or all memorize something else and like, you know, recite something that wasn't what we were supposed to recite, or like all these little jokes. And God bless those confirmation teachers, right? Like the heck that we put them through, I suspect. It was, yeah. So anyway, so there is something about bonding that happens amongst students in those ways, perhaps, and not with your pastor, but with your,
Actually, he said that to our class. When I had my individual interview with him, he asked if I'd ever thought of becoming a pastor. So there's a double-edged.
yeah, right. So, yeah, interesting.
Yes.
All right, so, Jean, one more reflection
I
on
was just
that.
gonna say, the other side of the bonding, I don't think a lot of us felt great. It was an expectation.
Yeah,
Very strong.
good reflection.
expectation.
Yeah, it was very much a thing that you had to do. You didn't have a choice. You're still at that age where you really don't have a lot of agency, right? Like you're still trying to assert that, but you're growing into a growing awareness of your own individual agency. And yet here you're still, at this thing that your parents are making you go to. And then you're going to get confirmed because, because I did it, so you have to do it, and your grandmother had to do it, so you're gonna do it. Like there's a lot of that attached to confirmation, right? And as with everything, and we've even heard of some of the kind of transition over time, even within this room here, of how practices have changed and evolved. Confirmation ministry today, in every context, doesn't look the same as it did, for the prior generation or for their parents or, before that. Things have evolved. One of the most profound, I think, things that has happened within much of our faith formation work in the church, both little ages or even working with adults, is a deeper, and those who are educators in this room know how much education has transitioned in recent history around the understanding of all these different learning styles. We all absorb and retain information and are deepened educationally in very different ways. And so to expect that a class of 30 kids are all going to benefit by memorizing Bible verses is just, we wouldn't even consider that as a potential outcome, having a positive outcome in today's understanding of modern pedagogical tactics and techniques for teaching and imparting information. And is that really all confirmation is? Is that what it is? Just teaching and exposing kids to this information? Or are there grander goals in mind? And arguably the goals are probably the same, it's just the practice is different, right? So we're working at a phase in the sort of cycle of faith formation that we're taking kids who are eager sponges for fun and for story and for laughter and now we've got these people who are starting to ask good questions, right? They're starting to, well, who is God? Because everything's sort of assumed when you're little, right? You know, we talk about, so God is gonna, you know, how many of you had some irrational fear of God, you know, like lurking around the corner, or you know, or comforting you, and literally like a presence in your life as a little child. Now we've got, you know, emerging brains and emerging thinkers who are starting to think for themselves and not just regurgitating the storybook that's been read to them 1,000 times, right? And so we're working with that group of people to help them and equip them in ways with tools and tactics and resources that will help them come to understand their own sense of faith and their own relationship with God. Now, no one mentioned this, but a really common, very common thing is that confirmation, certainly in Lutheran churches, but in many Christian traditions, confirmation is treated like graduation, right? You've graduated from church, even though you're 8th grade, 9th grade, maybe 10th grade, right? Like you're done. There's no more Sunday school for you, right? There's no more, you know, you got to go to this hour, you know, thing or whatever. There might be youth group and some other stuff, but that obligation to be in the classroom is gone. You've graduated from that obligation. So many people practice, quite honestly, a graduation from church. I don't have to go anymore. And many parents make that deal with their kids to get them to show up for confirmation, right? Did any of your parents make that deal with you? You finish confirmation and then you can decide what you want to do.
No, never did.
Never.
Think about the people who aren't in this room.
Generation.
Who's not here?
The other half of the
The rest of Peter's confirmation class, right? If you think about, I mean, you probably don't know what became of all of your confirmation classmates, but do you want to hazard a guess as to what percentage of them are actives in their communities of faith today? It's dismally low, you know, and so yeah, Steve, a reflection on that.
I know it's been a few years, but demographically at one point, they were saying we lose a lot more people between baptism and confirmation than we lose after confirmation.
Oh, interesting. Yeah, I wonder if those statistics are true, right?
I don't know if that's still the case, but
Yeah.
at one time that was the demographic.
Right. I certainly have baptized a lot more babies on a year in a year out basis than I have confirmed young people. So anyway, so let's talk just a little bit about how our confirmation program is shaped and how that relates to some of the goals that I'm imagining for our community of faith. But ultimately, it's not a graduation, right? And so I'm really sensitive to that particular thing. And my hope is that our confirmation program is seen as really as a building block and a stepping stone to the next thing, right? To further and deeper engagement into the life of faith as experienced in community, right? In the community of faith. There's something uniquely important and theological about our practice of gathering together. And we want young people, I would hope, that's one of my goals and outcomes, is that these young people are invited into a deeper story and not seen as having completed something that they can now go off and do whatever else they want to do, you know. And yet there's a critique of the church that says, okay, we bring these kids through here and maybe we've got a great high school program, but then they leave for college and or the working world or the army or whatever. And where do they go from there? And we all are aware of the statistics that, you know, that young adult demographics the least represented in the churches. And that only makes it harder for them to come back into communities of faith, even as they grow older. And so those trajectories are well established in the church. But are there things that we can do here locally on the ground? Church like Prince of Peace Becca, you left the ELCA, rostered ministry for a period of time in your career and weren't responsible for teaching confirmation. And now you've come back into that context again. And I'm curious if there are like ahas that have popped up for you out of that. You know, the way, you know, you served in ministry here in Minnesota, then when you went back to DC, you kind of got out of it, and now you're back, you know, asking like.
Well, so, right, just in terms of constructing a confirmation curriculum for the kids in my congregation. There are some ways that I was coming at it, not from scratch, but just had an opportunity to think about it in fresh ways. Again, I myself didn't go through a confirmation program, and then in my first call, I wasn't responsible for teaching confirmation at that church. And then I went into prison ministry for 15 years or so. And that certainly took me out of teaching confirmation. I wasn't teaching confirmation in jail. But I was teaching scripture, and I was inviting people into the life of the church and doing a lot of reflection with people on faith. And one of the things that was just very clear was that I could not assume in that setting that people knew scripture or the faith tradition at all. So it gave me an education in starting with people at very basic levels. We were saying earlier, joking, you know, is Moses in the Old Testament and the New Testament? People do not know the Old Testament from the New Testament. What's the difference between the Old Testament? Like so many people just have no idea, and you all are the exception. And we tend to circle up with people who think the same and have similar experiences. But just so you know, there's a world out there that does not know the Old Testament from the New Testament, let alone the Ten Commandments, the Creed, or any of the other stuff. So now, coming back into parish ministry, I'm responsible for teaching confirmation, and we just have a handful of kids. So a couple of years ago, I had two confirmands ready to undergo this process, and we were in the middle of the pandemic, so everything was online, and I needed to come at this with a fresh lens, like what approach am I going to take, and what material are we going to cover, especially for kids who were just maxed out on being on screens and not looking for more learning on screen time. So all that being what it was, I wanted also to take into consideration this tendency that people have to think of confirmation as graduation. So I started framing it not as graduation. I'm sure nobody intentionally frames it that way, but to say, you know, there are all these marks of becoming an adult in the world. One mark, for instance, is you get your driver's license. Well, nobody just hands you keys. You learn to drive before you get a driver's license, and then you're kind of welcomed into the world of that expression of adulthood, because you have a driver's license. And I gave a couple other examples like that. And I said, another thing is that this congregation is recognizing in you that you are ready to be an adult in this congregation. And we're not just going to say, okay, you're an adult now. We're going to make sure that you have the resources that you need to practice adult responsibility for the ministry and so forth. So at the end of this, you're going to have, you know, in the picture directory, your picture is not going to be with your parents. You're your own adult in this congregation now, and you're going to have your own stewardship invitation envelopes, and so, and you're going to be eligible to serve on council, and you're going to so trying to like set it up that way. We'll see whether it takes a long haul, but just trying to frame it in a way that invites them into movement towards adulthood rather than in the congregation, rather than graduation from and departure from. So you may tell another story at a time. So with all that kind of in mind, and knowing the limited bandwidth that kids had for being online, I really wanted to make the most of the opportunity to be with them and asking myself the question, what do adults, all of us, what do we need to be the leaders, to be contributors, to be participants in church life? And I didn't want it just to be my opinion, so I asked members at church, I asked the kids themselves and their parents, I asked council, what do we want people in our church to know about Jesus, about the Bible, about Luther, about the creed and the small catechism, or like where are we and where do we need to be with that? And I got a variety of answers. And I'm gonna tell you about the one that troubled me most. With all due respect for my colleague, because we're all working with these crazy questions of what is important and what's not important, and what does it mean to be an adult, what does it mean to function, and what's the future of the church, and what's the relevance of theology and all this kind of stuff. And so I asked one of my colleagues, a pastor named Katie, I asked my group on my text study group, and a pastor named Katie said, for right now, what's important, and especially in the throes of the pandemic, nobody cares about theology, nobody cares about the Bible, nobody cares what. They need to know how to be an adult. They need to know how to make an omelet and how to do self-defense. And she said, that's our curriculum, making an omelet and self-defense. And again, not trying to pass judgment, but because everybody's trying to do the best they can here. But I was like, wow. So there's that, and there's that broad of a spectrum of understanding what's important. And do we expect of each other? Do we expect of people who serve on council that they have the creed? I mean, probably not. So I'm not saying that we have to be hardcore and you know, have some outrageous standard, but like there's a lot of gray in between making omelets and you know, and so what are the important reference points for what we want of each other in terms of living into the life of Christ together?
If it was Ben, can you make an omelet? Because I can teach you how to make an omelet. This is a skill I actually have. It would warm my pastor's heart to be able to actually tap into my giftedness in order to impart important knowledge on you. Oh, we can also work on clam chowder. So I want to just quickly define and tell you how our program is shaped. And then I want, as I'm describing this, I want you to be thinking about how you might be able to, or have some giftedness, or might be able to participate in this work that we share. So our confirmation program, has historically been structured, at least in recent years, as long as I've been here and sometime before that, it's based on a 2-year program. So we have kids primarily start when they're in 7th grade, and then that's their first year, and then their second year is when they're in 8th grade. And then when they are 9th graders, they're a part of our youth group, which continues to do stuff, but not with a formal learning goals and things like that in mind. But and it's about going to camp and taking trips and experiencing the world together and imagining all kinds of stuff. We've got outcomes for that. But in confirmation, we do a 2-year program, 7th and 8th grade, and we alternate the year, sort of the major focus of each year. One year we call the Bible year, and this next year we call the Catechism year.
And the year after that, the omelet.
I like it. Nothing but omelets for a whole year. So last year we had our Bible year, and then so last year's 7th graders had the Bible year, and last year's 8th graders had their Bible year, but then they're about to be confirmed or have their service of affirmation of baptism. We have 2 that will go through that at the end of this month on Reformation Sunday, October 29th. So last year's 7th graders are now 8th graders, and now they're doing their 2nd year, which is the Catechism year. And this year's 7th graders are starting with their Catechism year, right? So all this, we do this, our classes aren't so big that we split them apart. We've had anywhere from 4 to 10 students any particular year. So that's kind of been our numbers. We have 7 this year. We might have an 8th. And recognizing that not all kids are the same, even though on paper they're the same age, but their maturity levels are different, especially in this age group. Their curiosity about the church and what's happening. And so some students are invited to begin at 6th grade if their families feel like, yeah, this is a good place for them to plug in and they're ready for this. And so they could actually do that 6th and 7th grade and then theoretically be done. And I've got a couple of 6th graders 2 that were 6th graders last year that are now 7th graders, but they're in their 2nd year. Okay, Bible year last year, and we did the full spectrum of the Bible. We didn't read the whole Bible, of course. That would be pretty challenging to do. But the hope is to have them interact with the stories of the Bible and what's the overarching narrative, the piece that Becca didn't really have as a young person. What's the big story here? What is it? And what do these stories point to? They point us specifically to God and in the New Testament to Jesus, right? There's much in the Old Testament that points us to Jesus as well, but this relationship that we have ultimately mediated through the Spirit. So we've got the triune thing happening there, the Trinity of God, Jesus, and the Spirit, God the Creator. And so we look at Scripture through that lens and through thinking about how these stories interact and spend time with how to just get familiar with how to find stuff in the Bible, because lots of our kids actually didn't get that kind of instruction when they were in 3rd grade, and maybe you did, right? And so because you were going to church every Sunday and whatever. And so by the time they're in confirmation, we spend more time thinking about the mechanics of the Bible, what's in there, how it was, what's contained in there, what are the different kinds of material that are in there, and what are some of the primary stories that we return to again and again and again. Then this year, we're going into our catechism year. Page 1160. You've been holding faithfully onto these hymnals. Very back of the Bible, page 1160. After the hymns. Believe it or not, there is material in here after the hymns. And that is Luther's small catechism. Luther was a pastor primarily, and he thought about how to share the faith. The small catechism was developed as a resource primarily for families to learn about the faith in the home. How many of you read your small catechisms with your parents or your grandparents? Yeah, a couple did. And it was a significant thing to do that at home. For sure, when my parents were raised, my dad talks about remembering having the catechism, brought out at the dinner table and things like that. And so we're going to learn a little bit tonight about whatever. And so the family would learn together. And 500 years ago, that's how the faith was taught. It would transition from the clergy, the hierarchy of the clergy and the priests being the primary containers for the knowledge of faith that needed to go to the masses, and they spoke in Latin, and all of these things. We all know the history of the profound shift that happened when Martin Luther introduced ideas, and they took root. More importantly, they took root. One of them was putting a resource like the small catechism in people's hands. The large catechism, if there's a small catechism, is there a large catechism? There is a large catechism. And that is primarily I would say, as a resource for faith leaders to kind of go deeper with these different issues. But it's a great resource, and one I commend to all of you is Luther's large catechism. So the small catechism there in your, so what do you see there? What's the very first thing listed in the small catechism? The 10 Commandments. Boom. And Luther did that intentionally. He starts with the law. He starts with creating a framework for a faith learner to understand God through the law. Now, if you heard my sermon today, you'll understand a little bit of why the law matters to us. there is so much more that can be taught around that, but we start with the 10 Commandments. And then what's the next thing in there? The creed, the Apostles' Creed in particular. There are a number of creeds that we claim as in our tradition as important to us in statements of faith, but the Apostles' Creed is sort of the most concise collection of that. And it's a statement of faith. Like many of you had to write a statement of faith for your confirmation programs and recite those in front of people, or at least share them with your pastor, or whatever it is. This is one we all share. And do you have to believe in everything that's written there in order to recite it? Ooh, trick question, right? Like it says, I believe, ... right? And then when you say that out loud, are you lying to me? Remember the 10 Commandments? 6? Number 6? Right. So that's a trick question. Sometimes we recite the creed, and this is hopefully what we teach our young people as well. We recite this aspirationally. It's like we're saying, I want to believe. Lord, help me believe that you created the world. Help me believe that you died for me. Help me believe that you form us together into a body. All of those things. So yes, you can say the creed and not necessarily believe with every fiber of your being. You can also offer it as a confession to God. I don't believe. Help me believe. And so that's just one nuance. What's after the creed? Lord's Prayer. Central to our relationship with God and our understanding and Jesus's particular teaching about prayer, right? And then there's other stuff as well, sacraments, and towards the end, what are some couple of things you see there?
Baptism.
Yeah, baptism and communion, and then he offers some sample prayers. Like here's a prayer you could use at the beginning of the day. Here's a prayer you could use at the end of the day. Anybody notice the office of the keys? I can't remember how it's labeled in there. This is the work of a, how did Luther describe it? The work of not a believing Christian, but one who leads others to faith is to be a forgiver of sins, right? To tell them that isn't it? Maybe they didn't leave it in this writing of it. It's in the Catechism, but anyway, so I don't know. Anyway, so we're going to spend this year picking our way through that and using that as the framework by which we are all of these sort of building blocks of the faith. And now this year's class has the benefit of the 8th graders have the benefit of having the scriptural basis. And so I'm going to be relying on Ben and his classmates to help carry the water of when we have to turn to scripture to look for the references or to be thinking about where it is in God's story that this makes sense. Where is it in God's story where we learn about the Lord's Prayer? Where is it in God's story where we learn about the 10 Commandments? Where is it in God's story that we learn about the Apostles' Creed? Well, there are apostles mentioned in the Bible, so this was a creed that was developed by those inheritors of that tradition of being apostles, being ones who were sent, that created that. We can talk about that another day. That's what I got to share. Oh, lastly, most importantly, be thinking about how you could help with this program, because I need your help. There's one way in particular that we want to continue to do, and that is in the springtime during Lent. We want to pair our confirmation students with another adult with an adult in the congregation that they're not related to, as a mentor. Not you have to have all the answers and have it all figured out, but that you are interested in having a relationship with this young person and to speak honestly with them about faith and about questions of God and what you experience and what you're going through in your life, so that these children know that there are people in this community that aren't just their parents or grandparents, that care about them and that want to have a relationship with them that is centered around these questions of faith, and that God is putting us and forming us into a community that loves and cares for and nurtures one another. And so wouldn't it be wonderful, if one outcome of our confirmation program is that each of these kids know there's at least one other adult in this church that cares about them. So if you would like to be a mentor, come talk to me. Please give a round of applause to my best friend, Becca Vargas, who helped me pull this off.
Thank you all.